of all, let me say that it's so nice to be here participating in this conclave, and I thank Arun and MJ for having invited me for this session. And the topic of this session is something that agitates everybody's mind. Terrorism is an issue which is the main preoccupation of the entire international community. And so, talking about can conventional armies defeat terrorism is one of the top items on the agenda of a lot of people involved in fighting terrorism. Let me begin by saying that there is really no fixed definition of terrorism or no agreed definition of terrorism so far. And we have seen that sometimes insurgencies transform into and take advantage of acts of terrorism to perpetuate their aims. Terrorists metamorphose into insurgents, so that there's a free kind of a movement between an insurgency and terrorism, and so the two gets grouped together. And when we really talk about fighting terrorism, what we are mainly talking about is fighting insurgencies as well. So I would concentrate on both these aspects during my presentation. Conventional armies are trained within the framework of national defense against an external enemy. A military is a fighting force prepared for interstate conflict. On the other hand, counter-terrorism strategies are made on the basis of the state's capacity to control internal conflict. This control is normally exercised not through the army, but the police and paramilitary forces. There is hardly an example where an army has been called to fight pure urban terrorism. All cases where armies have been used have been insurgencies resorting to terrorism. Even where armies get to be used, the most important lesson is that insurgencies cannot be defeated without a political consensus, and the military action needs to be supported by politico-administrative measures. Most insurgencies that have been defeated successfully were the result of use of brute force, the defeat of LTTE being a recent example. So that in that sense, one may say that yes, conventional armies can defeat terrorism. Nevertheless, even in Sri Lanka's case, 5 things combined to help the army action. 1, a political consensus brought about by an extreme right come center-right coalition in government. 2, public support, at least among the majority Sinhala. 3, army given a free hand tactically. 4, media manipulation to create a pro-government narrative. And 5, defying international pressure. One point to note is that no two insurgencies can be fought the same way. Each counterinsurgency operation has to be fought taking into account factors like 1, the way the army is viewed by the public and whether it has the people's trust to allow them to fight and kill their own countrymen. 2, the terrain of the counterinsurgency theater. 3, financing of the insurgent movement. 4, appeal of ideology. And 5, whether the insurgency is a violent consequence of the genuine grievances of the population, or whether the population is in fact not really supportive of the insurgency but has been coerced into supporting the insurgents. If genuine grievances among a large enough segment of population are dismissed for too long, those sitting on the fence also join in, and then it becomes almost impossible to defeat that terrorism come insurgency. We saw this in the case of Afghanistan, where initially brute force was used mainly through air power to dislodge the Taliban, and after their removal, the emphasis remained on pursuing Al-Qaeda and Taliban elements without not enough attention being paid to put in place other aspects of governance, removing of grievances of the population, and bringing economic development, particularly in areas that were the main stronghold of the Taliban. Excessive use of force resulted in large civilian casualties, which, along with neglect of principles of good governance, resulted in alienating the population and forced many of them to either join the Taliban ranks in active resistance or at least sympathize with them. The problem was further complicated since major reliance was placed on foreign forces to do the fighting, and the Afghan army and the government machinery came across as not yet capable of handling the situation. In fighting insurgencies, a tactical point would be to bring the situation to a stalemate and then create incentives for most to join politics rather than fight. On the other hand, if the insurgents feel that they can win or attempts at talks fail, the most likely route would be to be outright military victory. Here again, one can revert to the example of the situation in Afghanistan, where after the failure to effectively control areas and clear them of the insurgents, thought is now being given to look into the possibility of a negotiated settlement by offering a share in power if they abandon the path of armed resistance. However, a negotiated settlement would only be possible where the insurgents are convinced that the benefits of peace will outweigh the cost of war and that the offer of negotiations is a genuine move towards an honorable settlement. Apart from the situation in Afghanistan, we can also examine the insurgencies in Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas, which border Afghanistan, as well as the insurgency in Swat. These tribal areas became restive only after the US action in Afghanistan, which resulted in the displacement of a large number of Taliban and Al-Qaeda elements crossing over into Pakistani tribal areas. The population in Pakistani side of the border being ethnically the same, there was a general sense of sympathy for the Taliban, who were earlier considered as legitimate government of Afghanistan by these tribesmen, many of whom had also fought alongside the Afghans during the jihad against the Soviet occupation. Exploiting these sentiments of sympathy, many criminal elements banded together in various areas started calling themselves Pakistani Taliban, and under the pretense of fighting for the cause of Islam, attempted to create small fiefdoms for themselves. In the case of Swat, a local crook took advantage of a weak government machinery and exploited the general discontent among the people against an inefficient system of dispensation of justice and started establishing his own warlordism under the pretense of a struggle for the establishment of the Sharia law. However, his excessive brutalities alienated the population, and when the army action finally started, it was greatly welcomed by the population, even though the fighting displaced large number of people and obliged them to seek shelter in other parts of the country. Nevertheless, such was the popular support that the army was able to clear the entire area of Swat, Bunair, and Malakand from insurgents, who suffered heavy casualties. Many were arrested. Some hid in the surrounding difficult mountain areas, and some crossed over into Afghanistan. Peace has been established in Swat, and the civil administration is gradually taking over, and hopefully the army would be withdrawn as soon as the civil law enforcement machinery is sufficiently strengthened. Encouraged by the Swat operation, the army moved in to oust the insurgents from the various other areas of the tribal agencies, and successful action has been taken in South Waziristan, Bajor, Orakzai, and Mamand agencies. Action in all these areas resulted in the displacement of a large section of civilian population, putting a heavy burden on the government for looking after them and their subsequent rehabilitation. Many of them are still living in camps as internally displaced people suffering severe hardships. Nevertheless, they have braved these high hardships stoically, giving full support to the military action against the insurgents. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, 2 more minutes. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, as it is called, is not a monolith like the Afghan Taliban, but is a cluster of armed gangs or warlords and splinter groups of various sectarian and terrorist organizations in order to gain legitimacy, pose as supporters of the Afghan Taliban. To sum up, the lessons learned from these counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations are: 1, each area has its own peculiar conditions and action has to be tailored to suit that situation. Two, there has to be greater coordination between the Pakistani forces and the US, NATO, Afghan forces across the border. Because of lack of coordinated action from the other side of the border, most insurgents, when our army takes action against them, manage to cross over into Afghanistan from where they regroup and keep attacking the army from across the border. The civilian government should have the capacity and means to quickly take over the governance of the areas wrested from the control of the insurgents. Massive funds are required not only for the rehabilitation of displaced people, but also for the economic development of these extremely underdeveloped areas with severe poverty. Counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism operations require a composite approach which addresses the genuine grievances of the people in order to win their hearts and minds, remove conditions that would induce some of them to join the ranks of the insurgents, and a resolute show of force which would not permit a deterioration of law and order and convince the insurgents that their resort to use of force would entail a heavy cost. In conclusion, let me say that conventional armies are not meant to fight terrorism, but as our experience has shown, when required to do so and when equipped with the tools for counterinsurgency and counterterrorism action, have acquitted themselves well. Terrorism can only be defeated through removing the root causes of discontent and alienation, good governance, including enforcement of law and order, honest and sincere cooperation among the international community, particularly the neighboring countries, and no outside financial or material support to the insurgents or terrorists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aziz.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, let me apologize for the fact that I do not have a prepared presentation. As you've heard, I'm here because the National Security Advisor could not be here. MJ has very kindly taken over the task, which I thought would be mine, to chair this panel. So, in fact, I'm going to give you just a series of random thoughts which have occurred to me since I was told late last night that I would have to participate in this session. I started to look at the subject of the session, which was, can conventional armies defeat terrorism? And as Ambassador Aziz Ahmed has said, while I think we all understand quite clearly what a conventional army is, the definition of terrorism does in fact remain very murky. Just to give you an example, I went on the internet late last night and I got a 22-page document on the definition of terrorism from Wikipedia. Yes, there is, the first sentence says, terrorism is the systematic use of terror, especially as a means of coercion. The other thing which is clear is that terror comes from the Latin verb terrere, meaning to frighten. But apart from that, there's hardly any other definition that people can agree. No universally agreed, legally binding criminal law definition of terrorism currently exists. And this has been one of the reasons why the Comprehensive Convention on Terrorism in the UN has been so difficult to get everybody on board, because everyone has a different definition of terrorism. On the other hand, common sense dictates that, as Akbar has said, any kind of act of terror is terrorism. Use of force against an unarmed, helpless, defenseless civilian population to achieve aims, whether political, emotional, social, is terrorism. The question is, can conventional armies tackle this? My own feeling is that conventional armies should be used only as a last resort within your own country. Conventional armies have a military mindset. They regard the other as the enemy. However provocative the action, in your own country, your own citizens are not the enemy. There has to be an understanding of the problem, what makes people resort to violent means to make their voices heard. I think a holistic approach is more important to understand where the anger is coming from. The question is, when criminal organizations resort to acts of terror, this is not a common definition of terrorism. That is, the use of intimidatory tactics by criminal organizations is not considered terrorism as we understand it. Terrorism, when there's a particular aim to frighten a section of the population or the entire population into believing that the state of law and order has broken down and that the writ of the government no longer runs. The government is always therefore placed in a dilemma, because on the one hand, you have an obligation to maintain law and order and to ensure that those who wish to may go about their business in peace. At the same time, you do have an obligation to listen to the grievances of your people, and if those grievances are serious enough to force people to resort to terror, you have to ask yourself the question, why? And I think this is the existential dilemma that confronts us on how to deal with these very profound moral issues. I think that common definitions of terrorism have been used only to refer to violent acts to create terror, are perpetrated for a particular goal, be it religious, political, ideological. They deliberately target or disregard the safety of non-combatants and are generally committed by non-government agencies. I think unlawful violence and war have also at times been classified as terror. Where it is a launch across your borders launched by a group from another country, there I think a conventional army does have a role to play, because part of the army's duties are to guard the borders, to guard the frontiers. I think the army, in which I include also the Navy and the Air Force, when they see a pirate ship approaching our shores, when our sailors are kidnapped, if they do have a chance to prevent such a takeover by pirates, are obliged to take action, the Navy. There are different ways we can combat terrorism. And I think that essentially there has to be an international agreement in the first instance on how we combat terrorism. And which is why India has always urged the adoption of the Comprehensive Convention on Terrorism in the United Nations. And until we are all agreed what constitutes a terrorist act, we cannot take concerted action. When we talk about a global village, I think it's much more than a village today. We actually live in a global room, because what one person does directly impacts the other. When there is an insurgency in one country, somehow the contagion seems to spread to another country. We're discovering networks all over the world. It's no longer happening just in one place. Therefore, in order to address that, there is no other way except for international cooperation. Yes, MJ?
Now we know, of course, why you're in the foreign ministry, not the home ministry. But tell me, if you can't define terrorism, why do you keep talking about cross-border terrorism? We all know the border, and we all know what crossing the border is.
Yeah.
If you can't define terrorism, what right do you have to use the phrase?
Well, I certainly think I have a right to use the phrase. I'm not sure I can convince everybody to come on board and accept my definition.
Are you
of
looking
the
at
phrase.
Aziz there?
No, I'm looking at you, MJ. But, in fact, I came prepared to introduce my fellow panelists because, as I said, I thought I was chairing the panel. And I must say that for me, it's immensely interesting on the eve of taking over my new position, where I will be dealing with security and strategic issues, to share this panel with people of the eminence of General Jacob, who's been a hero, a war hero, and with Kaka, as he's asked me to call him, Ashim Chatterjee, who really embodies the other face of what is the struggle going on in this country, what is the conflict between different groups of people. And of course, I'm most delighted to share it with Ambassador Khan. We discovered that we had actually been posted in 3 cities, both of us, the same 3 cities, in Vienna, in Lisbon, and in Brasilia, but unfortunately not at the same time. Nor did I have the privilege of serving in Delhi when he was High Commissioner here. But somehow we have met and stayed in touch over the years. So I'd like to thank you, MJ, for giving me this opportunity. And once again, I apologize if my rather rambling thoughts have not focused specifically on what you expected.
Our talk is based on actual experience in combat and conduct of these operations. The first thing I want to say, the Naxal insurgency is the only one which is non-communal in India. It is in the process of escalating. Insurgencies can be tackled and neutralized by regular forces, conventional forces. I'll come to that later, provided they are trained to operate in a counterinsurgency environment. Example, Mopla, 1921, you recall it? Chingpen, how many of you have heard of Chingpen? He fought in Malaysia against the British and the colonial and the Malaysian government. The aim of the insurgents is to make the insurgency so costly that the government will, from a position of weakness, accept their demands. They seldom aim for a military victory. There is no military solution to the insurgency. There's no political solution either. If there was, it wouldn't have occurred. Military force should be used to bring the insurgents to negotiate from a position of weakness and to accept a political solution. This is cardinal. Example, Nagaland, 1974-75, I'll come to that later, where they were brought to sign the Shillong Accord. There are two factors required to keep an insurgency going: firm bases and lines of supply for arms and ammunition. To illustrate, Nagaland 74-75, we intercepted two gangs going to China. Thus, we broke their lines of supply. Then we went for their bases in Nagaland, and the Nagas then came to the negotiating table to accept a political solution and sign the Shillong Accord from a position of weakness. 12 years of peace followed. Afghanistan. Taliban bases are in Pakistan and in the south. Supplies of arms and money come from the Middle East and Pak. As long as these two factors remain, the insurgency there will continue. In Vietnam, the Americans won all the battles, but they lost the war. The failure to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, ensuring supplies going to Vietnam, resulted in the collapse of the American army. The Taliban are far more mobile than NATO forces. NATO forces are hampered by heavy impedimenta, are far less mobile than the lightly clad Taliban. The lessons of history are forgotten. Afghans under Ayub Khan were far more mobile than the heavily laden troops of General Burroughs in the Second Afghan War. Ayub Khan inflicted a crushing defeat at Myanmar on the British Indian forces. In 1969, the Naxal insurgency in West Bengal, born of, very important, this is born of socio-economic imbalances, this is a point to remember, was completely out of control. The Naxals controlled the schools, universities, colleges everywhere. Their headquarters, you remember, was in Presidency College of all places.
In the canteen.
And they were in St. Stephen's College, here in Delhi. A pragmatic Mrs. Gandhi ordered the army to break the revolt. I was made to oversee. We deployed troops by the end of '69. Troops were deployed in educational institutions, factories, etc., to prevent their taking over the trade unions. And also in Mufassal. By mid-71, the Naxals were driven out of West Bengal. I had met with Charu Muzamba before he was killed, also before he died in jail. He was coming around, he will tell you. Unfortunately, there was no follow-up. This is important. I want to hammer this in, of remedial socio-economic measures. Tolerance, sympathy, kindness, they were not there. The American involvement in Vietnam was to prove disastrous. General Westmoreland was not trained nor equipped to fight a small war. He had the all-American doctrine of World War II: find, fix in place, annihilate with fire, by concentrated fire. It failed. He never understood small wars. Our approach to the Naxal insurgency should be two-pronged. Pray note. Firstly, hearts and minds. Socioeconomic tolerance, sympathy, and kindness. That was not there in 69, 70. It's not, I don't know how much of it is in place now. And military, the military. Remember, there are two factors to keep the insurgency going. The Naxals get their arms from Nepal, they get it from Burma, they get it, and main sources from the locals, the police stations, paramilitary. So as long as they get money from extortion, they have enough money. So therefore, the two factors to keep the insurgency going will obtain, and the insurgency will continue. Our tactics should be, as was done in Nagaland, please, unlike Westmoreland, find, yes, intelligence and grassroots, we must find them, fix, ensure contact is maintained, surround. You have to surround them. If you don't surround them, they will break out. Close in, apprehend. Surround, close in, apprehend. The paramilitary practice of sending columns into the jungle has proved infructuous. In Sumatra, we were ambushed many times. We moved in tactical formation, unlike them. When we hit an ambush, we were able to deploy in tactical formation and break the ambush. The paramilitary requires specialized training. We set up the counterinsurgency school in 1970. I did. I oversaw it. We ensured that every battalion, before it was inducted in counterinsurgency, spent 2 months as a battalion in counterinsurgency training. Surely, we can do this for the paramilitary. Unless you do it, that insurgency will continue. Mrs. Gandhi was pragmatic. She took hard decisions. She ordered the army to break the Naxals. She displayed guts, as in 1971. Shakespeare's Hamlet is the tragedy of procrastination. Hamlet knew what he had to do, but kept on postponing it. Let future generations not say that our decision makers in North and South Bloc are the Hamlets of our age. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The subject is vast. The time is very short. And with co-speakers like General Roberts and Ambassador Khan, the danger of digression is there. That's why, to avoid the danger and embarrassment, I have put down my considered opinion in black and white here. With your permission, I will read it out. Can conventional armies defeat terrorism? The cynicism inherent in the topic chosen for today's discussion is a natural outcome of the failure, in general, of the conventional armies the world over to combat terrorism effectively. Or to be more specific, the failure of the conventional army in this country to devise and put into operation an effective course of action to end the problem of insurgency in the Northeast and Maoist violence in certain parts of the country. Incidents like the Twin Tower tragedy and Bombay debacle are clear proof of this failure. Whatever may be the claim of General Roberts, this stands. The question posed cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. In modern times, the fate of any war is not decided by the strength of the army or the quality of the weapons alone. It depends on so many factors. In any form of modern warfare, several factors play a decisive role. The state of the economy, the morale of the army, the support, both internal and external, for the cause for which the war is being waged, etc. But the most decisive role is that which the people choose to play. It is they who constitute the inexorable force that sets the ultimate outcome. The role of the people. I insist, role of the people, not the army, that is the decisive factor. This has been borne out by recent events and historical developments. With the withdrawal of a superpower like the United States from a tiny and weak Vietnam, or the setback of really existing socialism in the USSR, the undeniable truth has been established is that even superpowers armed to the teeth cannot rule or cling to power without the sanction of the majority of the people. This is the task of the matter. War has now really become more a political question than a military one. That is why even established conventional armies are compelled to resort to unconventional methods in combating insurgency and terrorism, as is evident from the 240-page document on counterinsurgency circulated by US Army headquarters in 2006 on the correlation of politics and war. Mao Zedong has rightly pointed out that war is the continuation of politics. According to him, politics is war without bloodshed, and war is politics with bloodshed. Separating them, looking at war and politics as two different quarters, is not proper. In order to understand the difficulties faced by the conventional armies, like General Jacobs, etc., the difficulties faced by them in its fight against terrorism, a clear and unemotional understanding of terrorism is necessary. Who are the terrorists? The question is a complex and controversial one. According to United States authorities, all Iraqis directly or indirectly involved in resisting the United States Army are terrorists. Whereas the Iraqi people and many in the Arab world and third world countries believe that the United States, in its self-appointed role of an international policeman, is the greatest terrorist in the contemporary world. Is there any ruler who does not hurl the epithet terrorism against its opponents and vice versa? It must be understood that only the fact of taking up arms does not make one a terrorist. The question has been already raised. Does not make one a terrorist. It is an undeniable fact of history that the guns in the hands of the Bolsheviks changed Russia once upon a time. It is the guns in the hands of the Chinese communists that changed the face of China. History has not branded them as terrorists. That is why branding insurgents in Northeast India or Maoist guerrillas as terrorists is too simplistic. That is what I want to say. In fact, for fighting terrorism, a proper understanding of terrorism as well as its difference with the people's war is necessary. What is terrorism? Terrorism is an ideology that believes in terror as the necessary, inevitable, and only effective means to achieve a particular goal. While the people's war is based on the aspirations of the people and depends on the level of consciousness as well as the degree of organization, terrorism relies on individual heroism and sacrifice and never cares about public opinion. A people's war cannot survive without the initiative of the people, without setting free their immense capacity for action and without their creativity. According to Mao Zedong, revolutionary war is the war of the masses. It can be launched only by organizing and rallying the masses. As such, philosophically, a people's war believes that people and people alone are the real creators of history. Terrorists, on the other hand, on the contrary, believe that only heroes create history. As to terrorism's contribution in its 400-year span of history, it is only a bunch of fire-eating heroes and their daredevil adventures. Though terrorism criticizes unjust social system, it fails to present any viable alternative. In fact, its failure to come out with any scientific analysis of social development makes the criticism of social systems important. Thus, terrorism, after much heroic antics, leads people into a blind lane. It leads them nowhere. Yet nobody can deny that terrorism has survived over the ages. Being self-destructive, it is defeated repeatedly, but like the phoenix, inevitably rises again. It must be understood that as long as there is oppression and injustice, as long as there is hunger and poverty, terrorism will raise its head inevitably as a voice of protest in the absence of a viable alternative struggle. One may remember that Russia had been a hotbed of terrorism before the advent of the revolutionary struggle. China had innumerable secret societies in the pre-revolutionary period. My experience regarding terrorism, of which Akbar mentioned and others also told, my experience regarding terrorism during the Naxalite movement has been identical. In the initial period, we had to fight terrorist ideology for establishing a mass revolutionary line. During that period, we acted as per the sanction of the people, even in the Presidency College, as per the sanction of the students there, as Akbar had dealt. But when we accepted the formulation that annihilation of the class enemy is the highest form of class struggle and the beginning of a guerrilla war, and then imposed this program on the masses, we become isolated from the people. As a result, the mass revolution struggle itself degenerated into a sort of terrorism, a socialism that is socialism in words, but terrorism in practice. That is the real cause for the failure of the Naxalite movement. I often see people boast about crushing Naxalite movement, and that honor is being given to Siddhartha Shankar Rai and many others, maybe including Ranjit Gupta and others. But the real cause for this failure lies here. Thus, the original struggle degenerated into a crude vulgarization of the original Naxalbari uprising. The same applies to the Maoist armed movement spreading across the country at present. We are suffering from it. Initially, the movement was welcomed by a large section of the people in this country. But the overdependence on modern arms, overdependence on the choice of terrain, indiscriminate killing of poor tribal people in the name of punishing informers through kangaroo courts, annihilation of lower-level CPM cadres in the name of fighting revisionism, forcible extortion, establishing hegemony of the party over the people by demolishing existing pluralism in rural society, all these have contributed towards transforming the party into a highly regimented totalitarian outfit. If these distortions are not rectified, the Maoist adventure, in spite of all its initial promise, I can tell you, will inevitably degenerate into social terrorism, and the whole movement will become a vulgarization of Naxalbari again. As a result, the Maoists will surely lose much of their appeal.
Thank you.
And 2 minutes only. An analysis on these lines shows that the fight against terrorism is more a political affair than a military exercise. Clearly, the task is beyond an army, conventional or not. Hope rather lies with the ongoing march of democracy that we are witnessing all over the world. It is a pity that we often forget the fact that hunger, poverty, underdevelopment, corruption, WikiLeaks, corruption and injustice, these all breed terrorism. If you want to fight terrorism, attack hunger, attack poverty, attack corruption. Otherwise, the torment of terrorism will go on intermittently, sporadically, off and off. Thank you.
Thank you.